My source of information were from individuals, Quakers who worked here, David Arnold and others like him. And basically, the Quakers, at least this group of Quakers, were very low key and they didn't make a big fuss about it. So the bottom line is that the Roosevelt Boulevard that's that way was always a natural means of transportation. It was an Indian trail, and then it was a stagecoach and so forth. So there was always wagons coming up and down the boulevard, even in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s and so forth. So basically what would happen is Maryland and Delaware were slave states. Even though they stayed with the Union, there were slaves in South Jersey, even some in Philadelphia, but slaves who were escaping from Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware and so forth would come north, of course, and the further north, the safer it was. But, Baltimore safer than Richmond, Philadelphia safer than Baltimore and so forth, and New York and New England were the promised land, so to speak. And so there were those who helped the slaves come north. So what they would do is, I don't have the information yet, but we would know, the directors and others who were here who were anti-slavery would know that slaves were coming up in a wagon of supplies, let's say. And again, there was nothing around here but woods and trails. And then around 2 in the morning or 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, they would halt the wagon in front of the hospital and jump out and run across our front lawn. And as you may notice, when we come up the steps, the ground slopes down very sharply. And the slaves would slide down that hill, and there's a door where they would bring supplies in, but that's also the door they would come in. And they would take a sharp left and run down that end of the hospital, the north side, what I would call the north side. And there was a drop door in the floor, very heavy copper door, because underneath there's a tunnel underneath us, and there's another tunnel underneath that. And that tunnel was for things like supplies and pipes and so forth. And they would lift up this drop door, and the slaves had no time, because down there, this was a pejorative term today, but back then it was a medical term. The rooms for maniacs is what it was called. And so down there, they didn't have any of the medications we have today. So those patients were kept down there because of the noise and behaviors that they were exhibiting. So they felt that when people down there were sleeping or distracted, they would go quickly down into the tunnel beneath, and they would immediately close the door. There was no time to stretch, use the restroom, or eat anything. They just went right down. So the sun comes up and it's a normal day down there. People are walking around over the trapdoor and everything else, and not realizing there are people underneath. And there could be anywhere from 2 to 3 slaves to maybe 5 or 6 or 7 slaves, depending on who was coming up in the back of a O'Toole's barrel wagon or something like that. Again, merchants who were sympathetic to the anti-slavery movement. Then the darkness would come again, sunsets. They would lift the door up late at night and they would come out. And if you go further down, the tunnel does go slightly down in a slope. And not super underground, but about maybe 10 or 12 feet down. Although there are windows to bring the light in for people who were down there. And there would be food and restrooms, and they would stretch. And then they would be told the next part of their journey. And as you know, it was very compartmentalized. So all they would say is, well, now you're going to Trenton. Now you're going to wherever. And, the driver would know where to take them to drop them off there, head further north. And then when the appointed time came, they would go back across our lawn here in the front towards the boulevard, climb in the back of a wagon or whatever, and then head further north. And that's pretty much our contribution to the Underground Railroad. It wasn't a very elaborate or, it was very low key. It was a place just to stay overnight until you could go further north. And the Quakers tend to be a little bit ahead of the curve in social issues. Now, there are Quakers who owned slaves back in the day. There's a Benjamin Lay, if you want to research him. And he was a Quaker who was an abolitionist, and he would, chastise Quakers who owned slaves. So they all weren't anti-slavery, but many and most were. And so that's why they would use this place, because they used to send bounty hunters from down south. Because, again, as you remember from your history classes, the Dred Scott decision, slaves were 3/5 of a human. So anybody who was helping a slave travel north or hiding out or feeding them or anything, you were an accomplice to a crime, because it's as if in today's world you had stolen property in your garage or, stolen parts of a car or something. You're aiding and abetting. and they would face criminal charges and even civil charges from the plantation owners. So it was a little bit gutsy and risky for the ones to do it because they were putting themselves on the line for it. So that's why they would stop here, because the bounty hunters who came north wouldn't come on the grounds. They knew that the bounty hunters did not want to come on the grounds because they had misconceptions. It's one of the times, I guess, where misconceptions or prejudices worked in someone's favor. They didn't want to come on the grounds because they didn't want the 19th century version of Charlie Manson to jump out of a tree and get them. So they knew that they were safe here for a short period of time, and then they could go further north. And that's why this was chosen, to have the slaves here briefly overnight and then further north. None stayed here, to my knowledge, the people who talked to me about it. And there was a gentleman, Scott Knapp, God rest his soul, he was an employer here. And he was a director of dietary and director of housekeeping. So he was a person who was grounded. He did budgets, he hired, he fired, he managed, and so forth. He wasn't some emotional, believe anything kind of guy. So one time he went down into the tunnel, beneath the tunnel, just to see what it was like and what was going on, because people would talk about it here and there. And he said as he went further into the tunnel, he would hear crying and moaning. And he backed out and came up, and he said he would never go down again. He took some ribbing for it, but he was steadfast in that. He just would not go back down into that tunnel. That's about the history of our hospital and the Underground Railroad.